Kagan, and you're listening to a special documentary-style episode of The Voice of Insurance, produced in association with Beazley. Beazley is a carrier that is synonymous with expertise in the cyber insurance line, and today we're going to get a masterclass in the cyber threat and how to deal with it from all angles. We're going to look at how that cyber threat is evolving and how cyber criminals are modifying their methods of attack in the face of an increasingly sophisticated line of defense from companies and government agencies around the world. We'll look at the new threats coming in the age of artificial intelligence and in a world where the CrowdStrike event has reminded us that not all threats necessarily need to be malicious to have a global impact, more mundane problems. We'll learn how companies and individuals need to react to these evolving menaces, and only then we'll see how the cyber insurance industry itself has evolved its products and services to better rise to those serious challenges. A decade ago, cyber insurers may have partnered with third-party service providers, such as threat monitors and security consultants. These days, the best cyber insurers are bringing those services in-house and making a holistic offering to their customers, one where everyone's interests are fully aligned to the best outcomes for all concerned. After all, anything that helps the insured avoid a loss has to be as good for the insured as for the insurer. In this podcast, we'll see how this is fundamentally changing the traditional relationship between insurers and their customers. Traditional insurance has long been a single annual transaction, with the occasional interaction if there's a claim. A cyber landscape that is changing minute by minute means that cyber insurers are building a far more intimate relationship with their customers, where they will communicate with each other extremely regularly. You don't have to be a cyber expert to benefit from listening to this podcast. Indeed, as the cyber world encroaches more and more on every aspect of our daily lives, and companies become aware that cyber threats directly affect the core of their business in all respects, being an avowed techie is less and less important. These days, the best CEOs and CFOs are increasingly aware that a cyber attack could be an existential threat to their company, and that this is clearly not a matter to be left to the IT department to handle alone. To help us cover this subject from all possible angles, I've been lucky enough to interview 4 diverse experts from within the wider Beazley business. They are Fran Donoso, Chief Technology Officer of Beazley Security, Sidonie Williams, Beazley's Cyber and Tech Focus Group Leader for the rest of the world, Raf Sanchez, Head of Cyber Services at Beazley Security, and Cybersecurity Consultant Alex Cresswell. You'll be getting to know them all in just a moment. But before then, I highly recommend you go to the podcast notes and download Beazley's latest Cyber Tech Risk Report. It's called Spotlight on Cyber and Technology Risk 2024, Resilience in a Game-Changing Environment, and it makes a perfect accompaniment to this podcast. Let's get on with the show. First things first, let's get straight into a detailed examination of how the cyber threat is changing in 2024 and where it's likely to be heading. For this, we need to start with one of Beazley Security's in-house experts, Fran Donoso. But before we get going, we need to bust some jargon. Cyber experts are always referring to a kill chain. So my first question to Fran was to explain what underwriters and security experts really mean by this scary-sounding term.
Really what the kill chain is just an insight into the series of steps that an attacker would have to take in order to break into an environment and achieve their objectives. The first step in the kill chain is something like gaining access to an environment or preparing to gain access to an environment. The next step could be, hey, what do you do once you get access to Fran's laptop? How do you get access to the data that you really care about or to ransomware the entire environment? So the reason that we as cybersecurity professionals care about this concept of a kill chain is because the more effectively we understand it and we understand how an attacker is going to achieve their objectives, the first thing we can do is try to stop them before they get through that whole kill chain, and then work on stopping them sooner so that they become less effective before they get onto Fran's laptop or before they're able to move away from Fran's laptop into the rest of the corporate environment.
I think it was important to sort that out early on. So the kill chain is the modus operandi by which cyber criminals work, how they get to us, and how they turn their exploits into cash. So how is this kill chain evolving? Let's get back to Fran.
These organizations are unfortunately running like a business, and that means that they reinvest their profits into R&D and purchasing tooling and capabilities that make them more effective. And it's just led to some really effective ransomware campaigns. And I think it's only going to continue to get worse unless we as a cybersecurity community and your listeners and as an insurance community adapt. There's still opportunistic attackers who are just breaking into whatever they can and trying to cause damage and get a quick buck. But the really well-known ransomware groups, they've now operationalized like espionage agencies used to, which is break in somewhere, grab a few documents, try to understand what they have access to, try to exfiltrate the highest value data, and try to encrypt that data. So when, like a few years ago, 10 years ago, they were just grabbing whatever they could. Now it's becoming much more methodical. And once they get the data, they're actually reviewing it, they're categorizing it, and then understanding the importance of the data for that particular organization that they've attacked, and then pricing the extortion attempt accordingly. And that's just terrifying. There's an entire ecosystem here, to be honest, Mark. So there's a concept of what we in the industry call initial access vendors. And that's just a really complicated way to say the people who break in initially and then pass off that access to another more sophisticated group who can actually steal the data or do the ransomware deployment. So what we see is an ecosystem of like, hey, I'm the initial access vendor. I'm just going to break in and sell my access to XYZ company to another group who's actually going to focus on the data exfiltration and ransomware deployment and do the extortion and then give me a cut of those profits. So we're seeing specialization in this ransomware ecosystem and cyber criminal ecosystem.
So far, so bad. Hackers are quicker and have more specialized skills. They tend to know what they're looking for, and if they don't know what they've got, they call in someone else who does know. It's much more like a traditional burglar stealing something like a painting. They may not know what it is or how much it's worth, but they do know they can go to a specialist fence who knows the art world and may already have buyers lined up. So how is this increased sophistication beginning to manifest itself? Well, for one, the original concept of cyber ransomware is evolving into extortion.
Previously, we used to see cyber criminals ransom a company by encrypting the data and making it inaccessible. Then we as a cybersecurity industry got pretty okay at backups and restoring so that if a bad guy broke in and encrypted everything, we could get a business back up and running in a relatively short period of time. Bad guys realized this and said, okay, well, in addition to encrypting the data, we'll just steal it. So that way, even if they don't really care about restoring access to the data, we can start to leak it. And then we started to see even more pressure ramped up on this, where cyber criminals started attacking organizations like hospitals or schools. And then not only ransoming the schools or the hospitals, but actually like reaching out to patients and saying, hey, we have your medical data. Why don't you pay us and we won't release your medical data?
It's not really a ransom in the same way, is it? We think of a ransom, of course, as, I've got something, give me some money and I'll give it back. I'll give you the king back where it all started. I'll give you the person back. You'll have to call it something else because it's not technically a ransom anymore, is it? It's just, I've got a lot of information I'm going to do something really horrible with it.
Yeah, extortion is the word that typically you'll hear used now. You're right. It's no longer just a ransom, it's extortion.
So, goodbye ransom. Hello extortion. Let's hear more on this evolution from Raf Sanchez, Beazley Security's head of cyber services. Raf's team is the first point of contact with clients when problems surface, so he has seen firsthand how threats have evolved. Here's Raf adding a more detailed perspective to Fran's thoughts.
Attacks like ransomware used to be very heavy on the technology response. So many ransomware groups historically would attempt to block all of the devices in the environment. And from an operational perspective, force your hand that way. And so you can see how really a lot of the response there would have been a technology response. How do we re-image 300 client laptops? Now, the issue with threat actors is as the technology has got better to protect the operational side of things, organizations can adapt and can replace hardware or can move to cloud services. So as an example, my email is in the cloud. If my laptop is down, I can grab my iPad, I can grab a personal device and access my email and respond to requests there. So threat actors have got much better at leveraging the reputational impact of lost data.
So we've gone from ransom to extortion and from the purely cold and technical to something far more personal and unpleasant. Here's more from Raf.
Cyber risk is changing at every level. It's like any other marketplace. There are the very high volume, low reward attacks, like the typical WhatsApp sent to 1 million telephone numbers saying, "Hi, Mum, I've lost my phone. I need £50 for a train ticket," which we see all the time, up to the very sophisticated payment fraud diversions, which we've seen. And there was a recent news article about a luxury car manufacturer. And very interestingly, the fraud that was perpetrated against them is very similar to something we've seen increasing against our clients, which demonstrates a real degree of research and kind of surveillance and investment of time to conduct these attacks. So the reality is, yes, things are getting cheaper. It's getting easier to do larger scale attacks. It is getting easier to do more targeted attacks. So the approach of organizations, and certainly our approach at Beazley, is to ensure that we're constantly reviewing, is what we're doing enough? What are we seeing threat actors leveraging next? What should we be communicating with our clients and warning them about? Another very bad loss was one that impacted a reproductive health organization in the UK and involved very sensitive information that was being threatened to be released. So that required a completely different approach. And that was really almost no technology in that one. It was really about the exfiltration of data. And again, this is where the threat actors have really adapted their methods and ensured that they can stay ahead of the security tooling and the anti-phishing training organizations receive. So I can expect that we will continue to see this potentially wider impact of incidents as the threat actors realize they can't just target the technology. They can't just target one element. They need leverage. And the reality is less organizations are paying threat actors. So they're investing more time in each incident so that they can get a higher guaranteed rate of return.
So in summary, things are getting nastier and more personal. It's a sobering thought. I think it's time for some good news. Cybercriminals may have become more sophisticated in recent years, but have government agencies had any success in making a more hostile environment for criminals over the same period? For this, it's time to bring in security consultant Alex Cresswell. Alex's career has been spent at the highest end of the UK intelligence and security community, so he really knows what's been going on. What Alex has to say may give you heart.
Well, I think 10 or 5 years ago, they were much more brazen. We've all seen that picture, or many of us will have, of the leading cybercriminal in Russia next to his Lamborghini. And that fellow felt that he could be quite open and brazen because it didn't matter. In fact, it was a point of credibility that his group had been around a long time, was a force to be reckoned with in kind of cyber criminality. These days, and with successive FBI indictments of cyber criminals and other measures that have eroded their sense of impunity, they tend to keep a lower profile. Now, they are still, to a large extent, protected. So most of the cyber criminals that we are affected by are based in Russia, and there is no extradition treaty that allows the West to ask for them to be tried in the West. So they are still enjoying a degree of impunity, but it's harder for them to do the things that they want to do, like go on a summer holiday to Cyprus.
And in terms of their resources and their sophistication in that sense, have they developed? Are they better resourced than they were then?
There is no doubt that they've developed, that they went into a really golden period where the ecosystem was full of specialisms. Now that there is more pressure from international law enforcement on these groups, they've shrunk and they've tended to go smaller and in-house. So they're not reaching out to different specialist groups through ransomware sites on the dark web. That's too risky for them, or they're doing less of that. So There's a little bit less interdependence in the ecosystem.
Is that because they're likely to bump into an FBI officer or one of your former colleagues posing as someone who's good at exfiltrating data once you've got in or whatever, that kind of thing?
They're likely to show out. They're likely to reveal something about their techniques that will lead to action, disruptive action by a Western agency. And what the Western agencies will do is that they will look at which cyber groups are causing the most harm and they'll get data on that, and then they will focus on taking down that cyber group. It is, to a certain extent, whack-a-mole, but it's a bit more effective than that.
That sounds like that's actually been a success for law enforcement. Has it diminished their capability if they have to do everything in-house only with the people that they can trust, absolutely trust? Has it decreased their capability in any sense?
I think it has, Mark, but they've also got stronger in terms of automation. So it has decreased their capability. I think a turning point was the moment after the Colonial Pipeline attack, when President Joe Biden issued an executive order which directed his country's agencies, the most strategic cyber agencies, to do more on criminal threats and to reallocate resource, do a little bit less on state threats and more on criminal threats. And once the criminals were up against strategic capabilities like that, they started to find it harder. However, they have got better at automating their attacks. And these days, once they identify a 0-day vulnerability in a piece of widely adopted software, they're able to scan the internet for it in a matter of hours, identify which companies are using that software, and then execute.
It's great to hear some good news for a change. So the picture is more nuanced. Yes, Fran is right that the criminals have evolved an ecosystem and professional specialisms. But as law enforcement and the intelligence community has become more focused, they are finding it harder to collaborate with third parties without incurring greater risks of themselves, and are therefore bringing the ecosystems in-house, potentially diminishing their capabilities to an extent. By the way, a 0-day vulnerability is a flaw in software or a system that a hacker has spotted but that no one else knows about yet. It's a bit like finding an open window on a building. The owner of the building doesn't know it's open and may only find out once the criminals climb through it and start stealing things. Let's examine in more detail this speed of automation aspect that Alex has just mentioned. For example, in 2024, we're on the cusp of huge developments in artificial intelligence. AI is a great way of doing a lot of things very quickly and of automating complex tasks. So, who has this amazing technological development benefited the most so far? The attackers or the defenders? Here's Alex again.
It may change. For now, AI seems to have benefited the defenders more than the aggressors. And that's probably because if you look at the cognitive balance between the people who work in state agencies or the people who work in the hyperscalers like Microsoft, Google, and AWS, there are some really clever people who work in those places who are the support for the defensive teams in those places. And using AI, they can, if you like, replicate their genius and their ability to spot cyber threats and allow other people to benefit through AI from their expertise. So actually, we think at Beazley that over the last 2 years, AI has largely benefited the defenders. It's made them more systematic and sharper at identifying threats.
More good news, but this is tempered somewhat by the sheer power of AI for good or bad. AI is certainly making phishing easier for hackers than it was. Here's Fran Donoso with some details.
We've certainly seen ransomware threat actors who are typically non-native English-speaking organizations actually leverage some of these generative AI tools to make their phishing emails more effective. Something that we often, as a cybersecurity community, used to say was, hey, look out for poor grammar or misspellings in phishing, because that's a potential sign that maybe you're not getting this email from your bank or from your coworker. Now that's kind of out the window. We're seeing these attackers write things in poor English or other languages, have it translated into really good phishing emails that promote a sense of urgency, which kind of trick people into clicking or providing their passwords or what have you. And we're seeing the same thing for other types of things, like attackers, unfortunately, using voice cloning technologies by taking recordings of officials from public companies, like as an example, speaking to the results of the last quarter, taking those recordings and then creating a voice clone that they can then use to try to trick somebody into thinking that they're speaking to the CEO or the CFO or their manager, and then have them potentially wire it cash or give them access to things that they shouldn't be given access to.
That's a shame. The dreadful grammar really did used to be a giveaway. Meanwhile, on the subject of the AI-generated fake CEO or CFO, Alex Cresswell said something even stronger.
There's no doubt that we're in a situation at the moment where our verification mechanisms, particularly ones that have to do with IT help desks, are outdated. So it is a fact that synthetic voice is today undetectable. You cannot detect whether someone is producing a synthetic version of a voice or a real one. And so that leads to opportunities for side-swiping security processes. So we've seen it with SIM swapping in the States, and we've seen a couple of big cyber attacks that were enabled by SIM swapping, where it looks like the attackers got through a telecom's help desk and convinced them that they were someone that they weren't. Fake voice, deepfake video in time may play a part in that. So I think it'll be a cat and mouse game, but we'll move to a more secure method of verification, which may include DNA, will certainly be more secure than the current multi-factor authentication that we go for.
So another thing to worry about. By the way, SIM swapping is when a bad actor convinces a phone company to switch your phone number over to a new SIM and can take all your calls, and crucially, your multi-factor authentication text messages, so they can access otherwise secure material. Another question is simply whether, in the rush to make the most out of all the benefits AI can afford, companies are opening up all sorts of unforeseen new vulnerabilities. Back to Fran.
Right now, I think of generative AI as kind of like another gold rush, but for Gen AI. And what we see is a lot of organizations trying to capitalize on that and doing so quickly. And often when you're moving that quickly, it's hard to take a step back and think about the security impacts of what you're doing. I'll give you a perfect example that's fairly recent. Microsoft recently tried to launch something that they call their Copilot Plus PCs. And Copilot Plus PCs were all about AI branding and AI capabilities. They came with an AI-enabled chip and had a lot of AI capabilities. One of those capabilities that Microsoft promoted was called Microsoft Recall. And Recall literally took screenshots of your computer every 5 seconds and then cataloged what you were doing on your computer. It did text recognition so that you could search for what you were seeing on your computer. There were a few problems with that, though, because they rushed it out quickly in order to get into this new Gen AI space and this Gen AI gold rush. They didn't secure that data very appropriately. So it actually was quite easy in the first iteration of that for an attacker to break into your Gen AI-enabled computer and steal all the things that Recall had screenshotted: passwords, sensitive emails, other sensitive information. And enough security researchers voiced their concerns that Microsoft has actually now temporarily halted the rollout of Recall and reworked the way that the security model for it is designed. But that's just an example of a really large, very well-resourced organization trying to rush something out without fully considering all of the impacts from a cybersecurity perspective.
When I think about AI and allowing smart agents to take on tasks for you, it always makes me think of the Sorcerer's Apprentice fairy tale. Is giving a non-human intelligence autonomy within a business just a recipe for problems? Back to Fran again.
A lot of what we've seen are what you would consider agents controlling other agents. So like a puppeteer that's an AI agent controlling other AI agents. And the problem with a lot of these things is that you ultimately don't know with generative AI what these systems will 100% output. You can't necessarily guarantee that, which is both good and bad. It means that you don't have to program for every eventuality, but it also means that these things may do things that you don't expect or handle something inappropriately. So I think that that is a real risk when it comes to automation. Often, the way that automation works today is you standardize a process and then you build the steps to automate it. In the future, it could be, hey, here's a problem, go solve it for me. And the AI agent may solve it the most effective way, but it may not be the more secure way or the best way to protect your business from a liability perspective.
So it could be worse than the Sorcerer's Apprentice, who simply programmed his broom to go and fetch water, but forgot to program an off switch. Here, the broom might go out and program the bucket, and so on, with even more difficult to predict outcomes ensuing as a result. Also, If defenders ever did develop a sophisticated vulnerability detection agent, it would be imperative that this didn't fall into the wrong hands. What else could be of interest from an attacker's viewpoint? For example, could a hacker simply create a smart hacking agent, unleash it on the world, and just sit back and wait for their crypto wallet to start filling up with ransom money? This is what Alex had to say when I asked him.
That is clearly what they would like to do. One of the things that is helping us on this is, first of all, that the kind of cognitive imbalance, that the expertise that is on the side of the defenders. It's also really expensive to train an AI model and to buy the GPUs that you need to launch them in your own data center, because it would have to be on-prem. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars here, and that at the moment is holding back some of this. But I think we should expect that there will be attempts. And we are moving towards an age of agent AI. We are moving towards an age of the internet being populated by agents that will run your diary, that will probably have access to some of your credentials in order to do online payments for you. And that will be a very convenient future, but it will also be one that has vulnerabilities in it.
Some reasonably good news there for now. Hackers want to get to the money as soon as possible, so with so much low-hanging fruit available, they're more likely to take easier and less costly routes to a payday. But this sounds just the sort of thing that better funded and more patient state actors might be able to have a go at. On the subject of hostile state actors, it would be foolish to have the chance to speak to someone of the pedigree of Alex Cresswell and not ask him about his assessment of the threat they currently pose, particularly given heightened global tensions.
It always evolves in an unexpected way. So we saw a worrisome rise in state activity in the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But it didn't cause us the problem that we thought it would throughout the Western corporate landscape. What we're seeing, and to a certain extent, there were some problems with energy companies particularly that became victims, but the problem was containable to an extent. What we're seeing now is a lot of pre-positioning on critical national infrastructure. You've heard US commentators, including a former director of NSA, talk about this, where they pointed to Volt Typhoon, which appears to be a set of Chinese entities that are pre-positioning offensive cyber malware on critical national infrastructure and on the estates of companies that are running critical national infrastructure. I think that's a concerning development, and one that both cybersecurity professionals in the private sector and also in government need to be focused on. But it is also the case that some hostile states believe that just fomenting chaos is an end in itself. If you can get a society or citizens to lose faith in their government's ability to protect them, then that is a win from a certain perspective. So critical national infrastructure in that sense could extend to large retail stores or things that affect people's everyday life.
The NSA is, of course, the US National Security Agency. Now we've laid out how the threats and the kill chain are evolving, it's time to think about how the insurance solutions that we bring to bear on this ever-changing problem are responding to meet the challenge. The biggest change anyone coming to look at the cyber insurance sector after a gap of a few years would be bound to notice would be the way that core cyber insurers are evolving into a full service model that incorporates a large amount of contact with customers, way beyond the traditional touch points of renewals and claims. Let's hear from Raf on this.
So we started as an incident management, incident response function, so very much reactive. Our job was essentially to wait for a client to call with a problem and help them fix that problem. And though that task and that area of our work is still very much important, we have really tried quite hard to shift our focus to a more proactive model, engaging with clients and helping them manage their cyber risks before they have an incident. Part of the challenge, perhaps, is that insurance is seen as a reactive type of product to problems. And so we're coming from a position where clients don't naturally see their insurance carrier as providing that value add. We very much want to be part of an industry-wide move to change that model.
Prevention is always better than cure. But let's get into more detail. Why else might it be better for an insurer to run its own security and incident response teams in-house? After all, this might be quite an expensive way of doing things.
I think Beazley's approach to essentially have an in-house capability is quite expensive. We are all relatively experienced individuals. My background is legal. We have lots of lawyers on the team. We have cyber consultants on the team. We have government/defense employees. And as you know, the cybersecurity marketplace is quite hot in terms of the employment and wage environment. But honestly, in the long term, it's, I would say, a no-brainer from a commercial perspective, because if my team can engage with a client early on, I can guarantee that I will save both the client and Beazley money. And I think that's the big differentiator between an in-house capability and an external one. And an external one will absolutely be staffed, I am sure, with competent individuals. That's fine. But most of these external organizations are essentially paid by number of service hours they deliver. And Beazley doesn't work that way. We are embedded into the business. We are paid a salary, whether we have 1 or 100 incidents. Our motivation is to ensure Beazley's success. And since our money is on the line, Beazley is putting out limits and essentially reserving pots of money for our clients. We know that the best way to protect that investment is to help the insured, not to wait until they've stumbled through on their own. And I'm not saying they can't do that, but they are generally doing that as their first business email compromise, their first ransomware. And I can connect them with individuals on my team who have done hundreds of ransomwares and experts who have done the same. So some of the mental anguish, the time and effort that you might need to invest in the first time you've done something, I'm trying to remember the first time I tried to wakeboard or ski or whatever, essentially that's what you're replacing, that learning period, with a ready-made capability.
So it's a big investment to start with, but once outcomes are what people get measured on, not billable hours, it seems that everyone benefits from an alignment of interest. Here's Fran with more on this from a security perspective.
The unfortunate reality of the way that a lot of organizations in cybersecurity, either software vendors or services vendors, have priced their services and technology is that the more data you send them, the more it costs. So often these organizations are kind of disincentivizing their clients from getting all the visibility that they need. So we've really been focusing here at Beazley Security at correcting those past mistakes. Don't get me wrong, Mark. I built those pricing models at previous companies that disincentivize clients. So we really tried to focus on how do we make sure that we don't disincentivize clients from sending us all the data and all the visibility that we really need to identify that potential initial access reconnaissance phase so that we can prevent an attacker from achieving their objective. So I think that's really the way. One, make sure that you have the right visibility and as much visibility as possible. And that means that you need to rethink some of the way that vendors squeeze money out of clients, unfortunately. And two, make sure that you have a team or a vendor or somebody supporting you to understand how those visibility requirements change. The things that we need visibility into continuously change because the way that attackers are attacking continuously changes.
When you hear it from that perspective, it seems crazy to structure this any other way. If you want to stop losses happening, why would you disincentivize your customer from preventing something that is in neither of your interests to happen? It's a wonder it took us all so long to work this out. I bet there are other classes of insurance that are crying out for this kind of model too. A joined-up model also frees up teams to allocate their time against client need and helps them focus on outcomes and giving good individual service when a client really needs it. This, from Raf Sanchez, really struck a chord with me.
We don't have a kind of budget in terms of hours of how long we think an incident's going to take. And even, honestly, we don't look at the policy value. We don't look at the premium, because some of the most crucial incidents for me and my team are those where we understand where if we don't help them, their organization may not exist after the incident. I personally dealt with, it was a very low premium. It was an owner of 3 care homes and they'd been subjected to a fraudulent transfer request. And I was super motivated to make sure we really helped this individual. The individual was very upset when they called. They really had no idea on what to do. And that influenced as well who I chose to help that individual. They don't need a lawyer to give them a 10-page report. They need somebody to tell them these are the steps that will ensure that your business will survive. So again, it's very difficult to say, but really the answer is that if you are going to do this properly, whether you're with an insurance carrier or any other organization, this can't be templatized. You really have to understand what the client's going through and address that directly.
That was impressive. We've been running quite a long time, but so far we haven't talked about the insurance market itself. So I think now is a good time to bring in an underwriter. My fourth guest is Sidonie Williams, Beazley's cyber and tech focus group leader for the rest of the world. As Sidonie's job title suggests, she spends most of her time with clients and brokers, listening to their problems and trying to come up with underwriting solutions. I asked Sidonie for her view on what sort of shape the cyber insurance market is currently in.
I've heard the cyber market be referred to as being in its adolescent or teenage years, and that struck a note with me a little bit, because actually I think coming into 2024, to me, it feels like we're sort of through that. We might have graduated, might be coming out of university, and we're maturing. I think overall, there's probably two main things. It's maturity of the market, but also growth. The cyber insurance global market has tripled in the last 3 years in terms of growth. And I think that will continue. All the work we do around the trajectory of demand and supply, I think we'll continue to see that. It's definitely been a bit choppy in the cyber insurance market in the last couple of years. You've had other people featured on this podcast talking about that. But I think we see now the market is really in growth mode, but also coming off a very stable base. We're seeing supply, which is great. We've had a lot of, in the last 2 years, really, you've seen a lot of different capital wanting to come into the markets. You've got traditional insurance capital, but think about what's been going on in the cat bond markets. We've had ILS investors interested, which I think is really exciting and shows that if other capital outside of insurance wants to come into this market, it kind of is almost an indicator of the maturity and that people see this as a very viable and long-term product that clients need, most importantly. This is definitely a required line of business.
So we have a healthy market that is growing fast and able to add new sources of capital to meet rising demand. Where is that demand coming from? I asked Sidonie whether, in a relatively new class like cyber, the biggest source of demand was simply an awareness of the problem, and an awareness that the cyber insurance product exists.
The biggest bucket overall is awareness, but I think if you drill into what is that awareness, where is it coming from? I think for larger organisations, cyber's been a top 5 risk for most boards for probably the last 5 years now, and we'll continue to see that. But I think we're definitely seeing the expansion into middle market, SME, and I think that's being driven by a couple of things. I think there are losses, whether they're on normal mainstream news media or within kind of more the infosec media. People are seeing how it can happen. And I think there's this idea that maybe a few years ago, people think, oh, it won't happen to me. But now it's like, okay, it's not a case of if, it is when, and what we're going to do about it. And more people are becoming aware of that. So whilst the headlines can sometimes be quite scary, they're perhaps sometimes quite useful in raising that. But I think the other things are all the new technologies and dependencies. I mean, the tentacles of the software supply chain continue to multiply. But I think there's been so many buzzwords, AI, software as a service, everyone moving to the cloud, data analytics. All these are businesses digitalizing as part of the global digital economy. And I think with that comes the awareness that if you are a logistics provider and you think you're bricks and mortar, actually your entire business probably is reliant on quite a lot of tech. So suddenly seeing it as a core part, you need to buy property, you need to buy GL, and you probably need to buy cyber. I think one of the things I often talk about is there was twice as many software supply chain attacks in 2023 in the previous 3 years combined. So again, the rate at which this is moving is really quick. As consumers demand companies are digitalized, that just then sort of expands the perimeter.
GL is, of course, general liability insurance. As the global economy digitizes from top to bottom, demand is everywhere across the spectrum. But are there any geographical areas that are standing out?
Europe is a huge growth engine for us at Beazley and for, I think, the demand in cyber overall. And then into the rest of the world. So, you've got Oceania, Asia Pacific, LATAM, Middle East, North Africa. It's really everywhere. You'll see it in different pockets. What will be interesting, it's territory driven, but also it's sector driven. So we're really seeing middle market and SME being a huge growth. So as the penetration goes down from a revenue banding, that will really kick up demand. I mentioned earlier about the tripling in the growth, and we expect to continue to see that. There'll be continued demand in the US and growth there, but it will be into international. I think Europe in the short term will be really, really growing that, and then we'll continue to see that trajectory going into other rest of world territories.
So everything looks set fair as Europe and the rest of the world pick up strongly as growth in the US continues, but at a more mature pace. I asked Sidonie what she's looking for in a prospective Beazley customer.
That's a very nuanced question. I think there's lots of parts to that. We're very confident what core minimum standards, sort of cyber hygiene insureds need to have in order to be insurable. I think we've tried and tested what those are. Not a day goes by that I'm not saying the words multi-factor authentication or endpoint detection response technology, the kind of core things that we're talking about. But I think we've evolved beyond that now, that it's not, again, that static idea. So take one of those, multi-factor authentication, MFA, for example. There's a lot to that. There's lots of different types of it. It constantly evolves. So I think it's not just that idea of, hi, I've got these minimum controls, I'm insurable. I think what makes a great client is the client that understands, okay, I've put these in place, but I'm also going to have to evolve and continue to invest in this. So the idea of proactive risk management within the ecosystem, continue trying to uplift as the threat landscape changes, you have to adapt to that. So adaptive, both from a risk perspective and managing that, but then also how your insurance responds as well. And I think it's really fair to say that there's not a simple answer to that question, because it really does depend on an understanding of their own business risk. So something that will be relevant for an FI might not be relevant for a logistics company, for example. They're going to have slightly different risk profiles. And I think as us at Beazley and other insurers, we try and pride ourselves on understanding that. So you don't need to ask the same set of standards for any one insured, and it will vary between large and small. And I think that engagement is key for us, with Beazley Security and what Raf and his team are doing. We want the notifications, we want people to call us and be like, what should we do here? How can we plug into what you're seeing and then use that to inform our risk management? That's the heart of what we do.
I also asked, what was the biggest red flag?
Perhaps the biggest red flag for me if I go into a meeting is meet someone and say, oh, it won't happen to us. That's, you ask the question, what makes a bad insured? That probably would be my big my big one. But, outside of that, I think it varies depending on what their risk profile is.
So anyone who is still thinking in terms of if they get attacked rather than when is not the ideal insurance risk. While I had so many experts at my disposal, I wanted to make the most of the opportunity and drill into the recent CrowdStrike cyber loss. As this podcast proves, we spend most of our time talking about malicious and aggressive threats to insureds. The CrowdStrike loss showed that the exposure from an error or omission is still very sizable. I wanted to find out whether this was a loss that was already in the playbook, or whether it had surprised underwriters in any way. The market doesn't tend to like surprises, so I was wondering if this loss had made anyone think twice about their risk appetites going forward.
No, I think in some ways it was a surprise that wasn't really a surprise at all. Beazley and others have been modelling this risk and assessing this risk since the beginning of time. System failure has been a trigger under cyber liability policies since really the dawning. I think the difference is we've just been talking about malicious events the last few years because they have been the very high profile losses. The risk quantification of systemic risk, supply chain risk, we talked about the ILS investors earlier, and that was something they really wanted to talk about. And there's been so much going on in the market alongside that maturity piece of modelling that, the sensitivity, stress testing that, look at the Lloyd's realistic last scenarios, that is part of this. Supply chain is a huge part of aggregation for insurers, and you're seeing insurers manage that across that portfolio. Now, I do think there will be some winners and losers on that on an individual event basis, both the insureds and maybe some carriers who perhaps weren't as aware they had that exposure on their book. But I think from a Beazley perspective, no surprises. We're very confident in the stability of the market and actually just responding to this. Human error is a huge part of triggers into the policy, right? And this is at its lowest common denominator. This will be what this will be. We've understood that for a long time. Cyber is fascinating, but fundamentally it's still humans controlling computers, right? So they're the lowest common denominator.
So it's very much business as usual. It might have been a surprise to some, but this kind of accidental outage has been contemplated by underwriters since the beginning of the cyber product. But was there anything we should take away from this on a security level? Here's Fran Donoso on the key learning points.
We've spent most of this discussion talking about the sexy part. In cybersecurity, we have this thing that we call the CIA triad. And that stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's what a cybersecurity professional is responsible for. And what I find, myself included, by the way, is that often cybersecurity professionals hyper-focus on the confidentiality and the integrity of data. We don't really focus as often on the availability of data. So I think it's just kind of a stark reminder to IT and cybersecurity professionals that availability is a key part of delivering security to a business. And that means that we need to consider the impacts of IT outages, either by cyber criminals or ransomware criminals, or by a potential mistake, like a human error that leads to an issue and an outage, a cloud outage or a vendor outage, or something like CrowdStrike. And it can be a really large global impact to your clients, to people trying to get healthcare, to people trying to travel. We need to readjust and reconsider the A in the CIA triad.
It's always good to get a reminder of what's important, and I suppose every loss event does that in its own unique way. But what of customers? What should they be thinking about more in this brave new world? What's the biggest mind shift that they and the security professionals around them have to go through? Here's Fran with some key advice.
We need to become more proactive and realize that the day of taking a few, or the age of being able to take a few days to patch a vulnerability is over, unfortunately. When things are directly exposed on the internet, accessible on the internet, and they have a vulnerability, you need to address it right away. And then we also need to realize that in addition to becoming more proactive, we have to be better at kind of accepting that attackers are going to be able to break in one way or another, that it's unavoidable, and being able to respond effectively to prevent the attackers from achieving that next step in the cyber kill chain. So how do we get better at responding effectively, not just preventing? We do need to get better at preventing, but we need to also make sure that we realize attackers are going to be able to break in. How do we build our defenses in a way that we can identify that quickly and prevent the attacker from achieving their next step and achieving their ultimate objective? You don't want to be the slowest one running away from the bear. So how do you make sure that your defenses are built in such a way that you're not the easiest target, so that when an attacker does eventually break in, let's be honest, I'll just say it again. Somebody gaining initial access to an environment, unavoidable. It's all about how you respond appropriately.
Sage advice. It's likely that it's going to happen one day, so we need to be ready by design to make sure we can minimize the impact when it does. We're coming to the end of our tour of the cyber world in 2024. Before we go, and just in case any risk managers are listening, I thought I'd ask Fran what he thought was the most valuable insurance-related product or service that insureds should seek out above all others. This is what he had to say.
I would say primarily the reason that we focused here at Beazley Security on building that managed extended detection and response MXDR product is because we firmly believe that it's the biggest value that we can deliver to our clients. And the rationale for that, Mark, in particular, is a lot of organizations have decent security products. What they don't have is somebody monitoring them 24/7 and responding to them 24/7. A lot of the breaches that I've responded to personally, and that Beazley Security and throughout my career I've seen response to, an alert did trigger. Some tool somewhere was like, hey, something weird is happening. The challenge was nobody was around to look at it and to respond appropriately. So when we talk about what could be one of the most effective things is somebody monitoring your environment 24/7 and responding on your behalf 24/7. These bad guys intentionally launch their attacks at 9 p.m. on a Friday or at 2 a.m. on a Saturday when you're not going to have somebody who's up and awake and monitoring. So relying on a vendor like Beazley Security or other managed detection and response or MXDR providers to do that on your behalf and have the training to respond accordingly brings huge value, because going back to the kill chain, we can then detect that an attacker broke in and prevent them from moving to the next step of that kill chain and prevent them from achieving their objective.
So if you could only have one thing, you should make it Managed Extended Detection and Response, or MXDR for short. We've come to the end of the show. Thanks so much for listening. I hope that it's been as useful and informative for you as it has been for me. Thanks to Beazley's expert team, Fran, Alex, Raf and Sidoni, for their time and for being so generous and straightforward with their incredibly detailed insights and advice. And if you haven't yet done so, do make sure you go straight to the podcast notes and download the report. Until the next time. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review or recommendation on whatever podcast platform you used to access this program. These really help get the word out. Before we go, just a quick reminder that advertising slots are available here and in other places in the Voice of Insurance podcasts. Podcasting is the fastest growing medium and attracts a high quality audience of key decision makers. It's also an intimate medium where you, the listener, are right in the room with me and the interview subjects. Needless to say, that means it's a great way of getting your message out directly to an audience because you know you've got their full attention. It's also very cost effective. So get in touch with Mark at thevoiceofinsurance.com to find out how you could be speaking directly to the industry. Voice of Insurance is produced by me, Mark Gagan. Music was written by Anna Gagan and produced by Carlos Gagan. Check out more podcasts and written comment pieces at www.thevoiceofinsurance.com.